more serious flooding in the new territories. Signs of progress in cross-straits talks. And Bosnian Serbs hand back weapons to avoid more airstrikes.
Good evening. Torrential rains have again flooded large areas of the northern New Territories. In the last few hours, up to 90 millimetres of rain has fallen in some places, multiplying the effects of a heavy overnight downpour. Villages have been inundated and dozens of people have had to be rescued. And the Royal Observatory says more rain is on the way. Most seriously affected were Fanling and Shengshui. From the village of Yinkong, they had to make their own escape. The rescuers didn't get to them till the afternoon. Firemen had to swim across the water to reach people trapped in their homes. This woman saw her belongings washed down the road. She and her neighbours had to be rescued in rubber dinghies. Residents from 12 villages whose homes have been flooded are being temporarily housed in a social welfare centre. One old man had to be taken to hospital. It's the second time in a month these villages in the New Territories have been hit by serious flooding. More than 100 millimetres of rain were recorded in Fanling and Tai Po overnight, and there were 13 reports of floods all over Hong Kong. More rain and thunderstorms are expected over the next 24 hours. The Water Supplies Department is stepping up inspection of the pumping station in Chin Mun. Rubbish near the station is being cleared away to prevent machinery from clogging up. During last year's flood, the pumps were damaged, cutting off water supply in the area. In Macau, 4 vehicles have been buried in a landslide. The retaining wall outside the church of Agostino on the Rua da Central collapsed at around 4:30 this afternoon. It's uncertain yet whether there are any injuries. It is in a residential area, but it's unclear if any pedestrians were trapped by the collapse. More than 100 firemen rushed to the rescue, and they are still digging through the rubble. In Taipei, Chinese and Taiwanese negotiators are edging ever closer to an agreement on a number of issues. After the discussions, mainland representative Tang Shubei took time off for an emotional reunion with cousins he last saw before the Chinese Civil War 40 years ago. Annabelle Roberts reports. Cuban President Fidel Castro is threatening to flood the United States with immigrants. His threat follows violence today on the docks of Havana after 3 ferries were hijacked recently and sailed towards Florida. Dozens of people clashed with the police and looted shops and hotels. Castro says the U.S. is to blame for encouraging piracy. One of the hijacked boats sank, but 2 reached international waters and were intercepted by the U.S. Coast Guard. Those passengers who asked for asylum were taken to the United States. The British Foreign Secretary says he'll stress the need to speed up the work of the Joint Liaison Group when he meets China's Foreign Minister next month. Speaking in London, Douglas Hurd said there is no alternative but for Britain to work with China on the future of Hong Kong. The Foreign Secretary said it's of crucial importance that Britain and China should agree on transitional matters despite their differences on Hong Kong's constitutional arrangements.
The Chinese have made it clear, and I strongly support this, that that's no reason why we shouldn't agree and work together on things like the airport, on things like the massive Hong Kong legislation, which has to be changed if there's going to be an orderly handover in June '97.
The Sino-British Joint Liaison Group has already agreed on the handing over of military land, though the accord has yet to be formally sealed. The 2 sides are also drafting an agreement on the airport's financial arrangement, but they still need to iron out some details on the amount of borrowings the project is to incur. And hundreds of Hong Kong laws have to be localised in preparation for the change of sovereignty.
We here in Britain, we will be doing everything we can to get this bit of machinery working faster. I hope to see Chen Shih-chen, the Chinese Foreign Minister, again in New York next month. And I'm sure one of our main themes will be precisely this. We've got the machinery, it's moving too slowly.
Hertz meeting with Chen Chi-chen at the United Nations next month will be their first since the passage of the Electoral Provisions Bill in the Legislative Council. Many schools in Guangdong province will not be able to open at the start of the new term because of flood damage to school buildings. The Hong Kong community is being asked to help. A group of educational organizations set up donation booths in 8 MTR stations today. The money raised will help rebuild schools in Guangdong and Guangxi, which were destroyed by the recent floods. The organizers are hoping to raise $200,000. Meanwhile, reports of abuses against returning Rwandan refugees is hurting UN efforts to repatriate them. There are rumors circulating in camps in Zaire and other neighboring countries that it is not safe for the refugees to leave the camps for home. More on that from ITN. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Robert Gallucci says it's too early to tell whether North Korea has adopted a new approach on its nuclear program. Gallucci was speaking after both sides resumed talks in Geneva following a one-month break. The talks, the first since the death of President Kim Il-sung, were adjourned for 2 days to allow the delegations to consult their governments. This report from WTN. And Mark, what's happening in the world of sports?
Well, the Goodwill Games tops the bill again, Jenny.
12 weeks after exchanging vows, the world's most famous newlyweds have finally appeared in public together. The Hungarian capital, Budapest, was where Lisa Marie Presley and Michael Jackson chose to finally step back into the limelight. They were married in secret, reportedly in the Dominican Republic in May. Jackson is in Hungary to shoot a new video which features him as a freedom fighter chasing away Soviet troops. What will Jacko do next?
That role stretches credibility a little bit, Jenny.
Anyway, that's the news. Have a very good evening. Good night.
Good night.
And a very happy new year. China's currency lost a third of its value today following the unification of exchange rates. The People's Bank of China fixed the rate this morning at 8.7 to the US dollar and will adjust it daily in line with market forces. Shopkeepers in Beijing say they may lose out, and the new rate is also causing some confusion. At Xiaoshuijie, a popular shopping area in Beijing, shoppers usually have to fork out a little more if they choose to pay renminbi rather than foreign exchange certificates or the FEC. But from today, the exchange rates of the two Chinese currencies are unified. Shopkeepers say their business will be affected. This man said he could take FECs and swap them for renminbi to make a profit in the conversion, but he can't do that anymore. The Chinese currency lost a third of its value as the country takes a further step towards making the renminbi fully convertible. The yuan is floated at 8.7 to the US dollar, and there are 112 renminbi to every 100 Hong Kong dollar. The change is likely to add to inflationary pressures, but convertibility of the renminbi will help foreign trade and China's rejoining of the GATT eventually. The move is welcomed by some foreigners in China.
I actually exchanged my FECs yesterday back into German marks. So, and if I change it back now into renminbi again, I would get much more money.
Others are simply confused.
There are various rates, it seems, and it's not at all clear what the rate really is.
Hotels in Beijing and Shanghai have stopped charging different prices for FEC and renminbi. Instead, some have converted their FEC room charges to renminbi by adding an extra 50%. To prevent prices escalating, the Chinese central bank may resort to administrative measures should the float cause serious problems. The exchange rate of the Chinese currency will be adjusted daily according to the market rate. Jardine Matheson, Hong Kong's 15th biggest trader, will pull its secondary listings from the stock exchange here by the end of the year. The company tried to play down any potential effect on Hong Kong's economy.
In no way does this decision mark a withdrawal from Hong Kong. Our business and our management remain in Hong Kong, and we have full confidence in its future as a special administrative region of China. I would expect both our business and our investment here to increase, just as they did after we incorporated in Bermuda in 1984 and after the move of our primary listing to London in 1992.
The decision follows Jardine's failure to gain exemption from the Securities and Futures Commission's takeover code. The monitors of Hong Kong money markets say a waiver will not be in the interests of investors.
The Commission would not be justified in granting special treatment to Jardine Matheson, or indeed to any other company, by exempting them from the application of the Hong Kong Code, because they are a public company in Hong Kong and because the code is necessary to protect minority shareholders.
In a statement, the Financial Secretary said Jardine's pullout is regrettable. Efforts to find a resolution which takes care of investors' interests and those of the company were in vain. The Chinese side has described Jardine's move as irresponsible.
我哋唔希望見到有啲公司呢個唔係從香港嘅大局同埋唔顧香港嘅經濟嘅發展同埋港人嘅利益，做出一啲極唔負責任嘅行動。
Jardine's has been protected from takeover bids in the past 5 years, partly because of a counter-hold strategy of its subsidiaries. But the moratorium ends next year, and if Jardine's is to stay in Hong Kong, it risks its interest ebbing away with the tide of localization. As much as Jardine's denies the withdrawal reflects a lack of confidence, the firm has, in the past, reacted to political uncertainties here. After the riots in 1967, Jardine's began to diversify its business outside Hong Kong. In 1984, when Britain and China were negotiating on Hong Kong's future, Jardine's dropped the Bermuda bombshell and moved its base out of the territory. In announcing the delisting, the company expressed preference to Bermuda's takeover code because its watchdog is the judiciary rather than the government. In Hong Kong, the future SAR government will have the right to interpret the SFC codes when Chinese sovereignty resumes. A government source admitted that the governor himself had tried what's described as finding common ground between Jardine's and the SFC. But Jardine's, like any other listed company here, is subject to SFC restrictions, for example, on mergers and takeover. So the questions are, were the SFC's authorities undermined by such intervention, and would the same have been done if Jardine's had not been the kind of traditional British Hong as it is? Jenny Lam, TVB News. The jump of the Hang Seng Index has turned stock watching into a favourite pastime. At brokerage firms around Hong Kong, speculators have been glued to television screens, getting their kicks as the numbers churned. When the index surged past the 9,000 point in mid-afternoon, there were celebrations all round. The index closed at 9,031 points, up 267.15 points. But some investors say they are worried of an eventual bust. It's dangerous, says this man. I don't dare to buy in case there will be a big fall. The Financial Secretary has warned of a volatile market.
These are not markets for widows and pensioners. These are markets for people who know what they're doing and who have money which they've also got money somewhere more conservative, and then they put some of the money into the stock market. I think people just have to be sensible and careful.
Turnover exceeded $10 billion for the first time in Hong Kong's history. The chairman of the stock exchange is confident that the checks and balances can handle big fluctuations.
The stock exchange today is a very different stock exchange, say, from that in 1987, both in terms of settlement system, settlement capability, trading capability, trading system, and also in terms of surveillance system. We are confident that we can handle any dramatic rise or fall in the market.
But Charles Lee also called for cautious trading. Jenny Lam, TVB News. Britain and China have agreed that these electoral talks should speed up after 15 rounds of futile discussions. As they reconvene for the 16th round this morning, the new approach is to get the less controversial issues out of the way.
We on our part do hope to accelerate the pace and progress of the talks so as to reach an early agreement between the two sides, and in final, so as to facilitate smooth transfer of Hong Kong in 1997.
We also think it should be possible to arrive quite quickly at a first understanding covering some of the more straightforward issues relating to the three levels of elections that have to be held in Hong Kong in 1994 and 1995.
Those supposedly easier issues are the voting age, the voting method, and whether district board members should be appointed. But the gap remains on the difficult items. One of those are the criteria legislators should satisfy if they are to serve beyond the Chinese takeover. Back at the embassy after the morning session, the British leader, Christopher Hum, talked about the so-called through-train concept.
What I can say is we have some ideas and we put them forward and we'll be discussing them.
He wouldn't say whether it's acceptable to include in a legislator's oath wordings other than swearing to abide by the law. That is the nature of the new ideas on the through-train question. Jiang Anju made clear these talks shouldn't drag on till the summer. That's the first indication from the Chinese side how long they're willing to go on for. Well, summer seems a long way away, so perhaps new leadership on the British side can help bring a thaw to Hong Kong's frozen constitutional development. Jenny Lam, TVB News, Beijing. The governor today expressed disappointment that the electoral talks have been fruitless after 16 rounds.
I just make the point, without being provocative, that you can't go on and on and on forever. It should have taken days, not seasons, to reach agreement on these less contentious issues. And yet spring has given way to summer. Summer has given way to autumn. Autumn has now handed over to winter. And still, the less contentious issues remain doggedly unresolved, not to mention the more difficult ones.
Meanwhile, Executive Councillor Felice Learmac admitted the negotiations have a December deadline.
And I think the discussions has been going on for long enough. People of Hong Kong do want to see a successful conclusion to the talks.
But having failed to reach a first understanding last week, a Chinese source today said Beijing has no problem with lowering the voting age to 18 years. But on the voting method, he argued that single-seat, single-vote constituencies need not apply to the Legislative Council polls, even if it's accepted for the Municipal Council elections. Proportional representation is also on the card. The source said China does not want any single political party to dominate the Legislative Council. On whether legislators can serve beyond the Chinese takeover, the source pointed out that it has to be retrospective in deciding whether an individual should be disqualified. This is because China considers activities such as helping dissidents to flee the country after the Tiananmen Square crackdown as confrontational against the Beijing government. In response, a government house spokesman questioned why Beijing would not come to an agreement if the Chinese side has no problem on lowering the voting age. He said that indicates the extent of the gap between the two sides on both minor and major issues. Jenny Lam, TVB News. The governor is beginning his week-long official visit to Australia in Sydney. He will be meeting the Prime Minister Paul Keating on Tuesday. Chris Patten denies he is here to seek Australian backing for his democratic proposals.
The purpose of this visit, as in other visits, is not to try to win support for our efforts to implement the joint declaration in Hong Kong. Our friends around the world know that we're trying to do that. The purpose is to strengthen and develop our bilateral economic and trading relationships.
But he says he's grateful for the Foreign Minister Gareth Evans's earlier show of support.
I very much hope that they will express their understanding and support for the importance of implementing the joint declaration, because that's the basis of Hong Kong's future success.
The Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, dropped Hong Kong from his Asian tour last year without explaining why. He has never indicated in public his position on the governor's proposal. For Keating, it'll be a balancing act. He's strong on boosting Australia's image in Asia, so upsetting Beijing will be a dodgy move. But not showing support for Chris Patten's proposal is just as tricky for a leader who's democratically elected himself. Jenny Lam, TVB News, Sydney.
From Jenny Lam, who spent all day out in the new territories.
Thank you, Diana.
Jenny?
I'm in Sha Tin at the moment, and actually more and more people are now coming out to vote, maybe after their supper. This particular constituency here is called Hang On, and well, the wider political picture of Hong Kong does actually hang on to how the votes will swing today. 2 years of political row between Britain and China on just how much say the ordinary men and women of Hong Kong should have in who represent them. And today is a show of whether it was all worth it. The district board election is the real test of whether Chris Patton's democratic reform gets the thumbs up from Hong Kong. The architect of how these polls are conducted has been out and about, encouraging voters to exercise their right to choose.
Last time at about 5:30, I think about 260,000 had voted. This time there's about 150,000 more than that, 412,000. So at 5:30, we've almost got as many people voting as voted in the whole of the DB elections last time. It's a huge increase.
The work of the district boards may be about the nitty-gritty of Hong Kong life. For example, local matters like education, traffic, and whether the streets are kept clean. But today's winners will also have great influence on next year's Legco election. 10 legislators will be returned by the election committee, made up entirely of district board members. So any party which clinches 10% of the district board seats effectively control one seat in Legco. Today's battle is really between the pro-democracy faction, that is the UDHK, Meeting Point and HKDF, the pro-China camp represented by the DAB and the LDF, the Liberal Party, and candidates who have strong local backing. For the handful of independents, this is a pretty tough fight. An exit poll earlier showed political affiliations of candidates does not make any difference to how 45.5% of voters make their decision. But for more than 58% of them, past performances count. This particular housing estate, for example, is a real battleground for the political parties. It's a relatively newly developed area, so none of them is particularly well established here, but they are doing everything they can to woo the voters right up to the doorstep of the polling station. Well, that's it from me here in Sha Tin. Now back to you, Diana, over in Central. Local bird watchers have been testing their skills and at the same time raising money for a worthy cause. More than 60 people took part in this year's Big Bird Race, and they've collected more than $1 million for the Mai Po Nature Reserve. Dawn over the new territories, and the chorus begins. 16 teams have been watching the birds round the clock since yesterday evening. The game is to spot as many species as possible. The sponsored exercise aims to raise funds for the nature reserve at Mai Po, and it's easy to see why they want to protect the splendour. Some of the birds here, like the black-faced spoonbill, are close to extinction. There are only about 300 left, and Mai Po is a safe haven for most of them.
They banned hunting in Hong Kong in about 1980, and you find the birds in Hong Kong are much tamer than they are in China. Once you get north of the border, it's very hard to see anything, but here the birds are quite bold and they sit up and they're much easier to see.
The mangroves and marshes here make this one of the most unusual bird habitats in the world. But during recent years, urban development across the border has forced many of the species away from their homes, which makes conservation here at Mai Po ever more important. You've been there?
No, I haven't. I'll have to go out and have a look. Wonderful pictures.
Definitely. That's the news. Good evening.
Good night.